back, and we're still talking debt right here. And this time is about corporate debt. See a record 1.5 trillion naira of local currency 22, representing a 133% increase from the 2021 level. And now, more than ever, with the uncertainty surrounding access to capital needed to expand, business operations, companies have found solace in commercial papers. Well, let's talk to PoliticsToday, Majeko Dumina, Managing Director, GCR Ratings Nigeria. Join us right here in the studio. Great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me, Laddie.
Yeah, so quite a jump for 2022 for corporate issuances, compared to 2021. But before we, drill down on 2022, there was a slowdown.
Yes.
In 2021. What do you think drove that?
So yes, there was a slowdown in 2021. In fact, debt issuance, and when we're talking about debt issuance, we're talking about commercial paper and bonds, that came down around 38%. Now really back then, in 2021, that was down to the fact that we saw interest rates rise from a fairly low base. So before 2021, late 2020, yields were very low. And then they started to increase quite quickly in 2021. If you are looking at treasury bills specifically, the 364-day T-bill rates increased from about 5%, I think, in February 2021 to a peak of near to 15%. That increase actually meant that corporate Nigeria issued a lot less when it came to debt issuances, commercial paper and bonds.
And for 2022, then we saw that, big jump.
Exactly. So a significant jump. So in 2022, let me just frame things. We saw, like you said, 1.5 trillion naira of debt issuance. That's about $3.2 billion. And like I said, it's coming from commercial paper and bonds. So when we say bonds, anything over a year in maturity, commercial paper is less than a year. And about 50-50. So of that 1.5 trillion, about $250 billion was from commercial paper, and about $250 billion was from bonds. Now, from the commercial paper perspective, we actually saw 140 transactions, commercial paper transactions in 2022, and this is really just down to corporates in Nigeria managing their cash flow. When you have inconsistent cash flow or there's near-term uncertainty, because last year there was very high inflation, which we still see as of today, but spiraling fuel costs, there was supply-side disruptions. Corporate Nigeria just really needed that liquidity balance, if you like, to manage itself. So you saw a lot of corporates issuing commercial paper. Now, on the bond side, you saw big-ticket transactions. So I think if you look at the top 5 transactions, they probably made up a large chunk of, again, the $250 billion naira of bond issuance that we saw. So last year we saw big transactions that were really a part of capital expenditure projects and also some acquisitions. So let's take it from the biggest to the relatively smallest. Dangote Industries, whose parent company effectively of Dangote Sugar and the owner of the refinery, and Dangote Cement, of course, they issued 300 billion naira really as part of the financing of the refinery. Next in line was Dangote Cement, which issued, I think, 116 billion naira, and that was part of expanding some of its Nigerian projects or its Nigerian expansion projects here. Then you had MTN, slightly below, that's at 115 billion naira to expand its 5G network. Then in terms of the smaller but still large issuances, we saw Geregu Power. They issued around 40 billion naira as part of an acquisition or to fund an acquisition of a power plant. And then we saw Presco, Nigeria, which is in the palm oil business, raised 30 billion naira to acquire as part of the acquisition of another entity in the palm oil business. And then lastly, Lagos Free Zone Company, they raised 25 billion naira of guaranteed debt, guaranteed by InfraCredit, I believe, and that was to develop some of their assets in the free zone area. So a lot of big ticket transactions, and that really was what was driving issuance in 2022.
Yeah, quite big. But looking at the composition, at this time, we're seeing corporates here, get more towards local currency debt at this time.
Yeah.
obviously we know what's happening with foreign,
Yeah.
currency. But is there any risk, because there's still that issue of currency devaluation? How's that playing into it?
There is. So, like you mentioned, because of the foreign currency challenges in the economy, that kind of manifests itself in terms of foreign currency shortages and just weakened relationships between, say, Nigerian banks and correspondent banks, foreign correspondent banks. So, if a Nigerian company does have access to hard currency in the form of US dollars, it tends to be very expensive. When I say expensive, in terms of the interest applied to those types of borrowing. And of late, it's just not really a viable form of funding for Nigerian corporates. So you've seen a lot of Nigerian corporates just raise their money locally in Naira and these capital markets. And local markets are more than capable of funding these businesses. Obviously, there's credit risk behind lending anywhere, regardless of whether you're in Nigeria. And that's what we do as a business. We analyze credit risk. We tell investors, we give investors information on the risk behind debt instruments and allow them to make an informed decision. But yes, there's always going to be that credit risk there behind these debt instruments.
And definitely a big jump, 133%. What is this level of issuance? What does it mean for the Nigerian economy?
Well, I mean, capital markets are always very beneficial for economies, and we've seen this all around the world. Allows the private sector to effectively grow. So capital markets fund growth. And if you're funding growth, you're obviously increasing aggregate demand within the economy. You're creating jobs. And from that, ultimately, you're supporting economic growth within the economy. Also, I think capital markets allow for a lot more efficient allocation of capital within an economy, more efficient than just banks providing bilateral loans between themselves and their clients. And also, lastly, I think it's very good for the diversity of risk within the economy. You end up with less pockets of risk in terms of those holding debt or those investors holding debt. Capital markets help the economy move that around. So when we see lots of issuance like we saw in 2022, it's generally a positive thing.
And obviously, when you have these issuances, there are buyers. And, markets, we have, institutional, buyers, and we have retail. But looking at these issuances, who are the buyers at this time?
So the buyers are, I think, two, or really you can call them three main buyers. You have the pension funds in Nigeria, you have your mutual funds and / asset managers. So in terms of pension funds in Nigeria have about 15 trillion assets under management, which I think is about, using official exchange rates of today, is about $33 billion. Now, of those 15 trillion of assets under management, they have about 1.4 trillion in corporate bonds. Now, just to give you the quantum, the size of corporate bonds outstanding, as of, I think, February end, there's about 2.1 trillion of corporate bonds outstanding. What's that? About $4.6 billion. Now, so I'm basically saying of those $2.1 trillion, 1.4 is held within pension funds or thereabouts. And I think the bulk of the rest is coming from your asset managers / mutual funds. So those are the key investors here in Nigeria.
And definitely where they're sellers, they're always
exactly,
buyers at this point. So what's the outlook for issuance in 2023?
Okay. So in this report we wrote last week, or we published last week, we think issuance this year is going to remain robust. And going forward, I believe we'll see continuous growth in issuance. Now, we have very good oversight of that as a rating agency, GCR. In Nigeria, we rate 80% of outstanding debt. So when I mentioned that 2.1 trillion, that $4.6 billion equivalent, we rate 80% of that. So we have very good sight of this stuff. So I think what we think is going to drive issuance this year is, firstly, we've seen a fall in yields. Yields have come back down. Although in recent weeks there's been some moderation in that fall and they're ticking back up. But basically at the end of last year, we saw the largest Federation allocations or Federation account allocations of the year in December at close to 1 trillion naira. We also saw, because of the Naira redesign policy, at the end of January this year, 2 months prior to that, we saw close to 2 trillion Naira come into the financial system. Now, all that liquidity needs somewhere to go, and that effectively crashed yields in money markets. So when we talk about money market yields, it's kind of a proxy for where corporate debt instrument yields would be. If money market yields are coming down, then it's likely to be cheaper for corporates to borrow. Now, because it's cheaper for corporates to borrow, we're likely to see more issuance in the near term. So that's what we're saying there. But generally speaking, I think bonds, commercial paper just allow for effectively a viable form of funding. If you look at how much or at what level banks are currently lending at, what rate they're lending at, if you use this data is all available within the CBN. The prime rate for lending within Nigeria's banks is around, I think, between 13 and 14%. In fact, some banks, their prime rate is as high as 28%. But when you look at what these corporates are achieving in capital markets, it's anywhere between 12 and 13%. So capital markets and debt issuance allows corporates to borrow at a cheaper rate. I think also, to answer your question deeper, given that we have the new leadership coming in, I think once we see what the political direction of new leadership will be, corporates in Nigeria will be able to make better informed decisions, and we'll actually see an uptick in issuance again, or probably over the second half of the year.
I'll be looking out for subscription also with that. Thank you so much.
No problem.
I was Akintunde Majekodunmi, Managing Director, GCR Ratings. It was great having your perspective.
Thank you very much, Ladi.
Today.
Thank you.
All right, so yeah, we're talking debt market there. We have other markets coming up in just a little bit. We'll have John McQuarrie giving us the details what happened in the markets, talk about the NGX and the fixed income market. That's in a moment. Do stay with us.